My name is Mark Damazer. I'm the Master of St. Peter's College here in Oxford. Congratulations for getting this far. But we have a very creamy and distinguished, not to say diverse, panel for you to discuss investing in tomorrow's economies, a title which in itself begs a few questions. So I'll introduce them, as it were, from right to left before I explain how we'll divide up the 55 minutes that we have at our disposal. So Jacqueline Novogratz is the founder and chief executive officer of the Acumen Fund, which is a non-profit global venture fund. She began her life at Chase Manhattan Bank at a point at which banking was considered a legitimate activity, but has graduated, one might say, from there to the heights of the Acumen Fund, investing so far nearly $80 million in 70 companies in South Asia and Africa. Amit Mehra is founder and managing director of Reuters Market Light, which is a pioneering business involving mobile phone applications able to distribute information about agriculture and products to many people in India. Well over 1 million direct users and 5 million in all are able to benefit from the app. Charles Tang, chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry, formerly on the executive board of the Bank of Boston in Brazil and currently heading a Brazilian mineral asset development company. And for his sins, he is also something of a journalist, writing for the main and most popular paper in Brazil, which modesty forbids me from trying to pronounce. And he also writes for the People's Daily International Financial News. And finally, immediately to my right, Camilla Toulmin, who is director of the International Institute for Environment and Development and has been since 2004, a trained economist and working mostly on agriculture, land issues, and climate. So the way I propose that we devise the time is I shall ask in a minute or two Jacqueline to give a 10-minute or so address on the main theme, and then we'll ask each of the individual panel members to respond rather briefly at first instance to what Jacqueline has to say. And then we'll have a discussion just up here for perhaps 15 or 20 minutes before we throw it open for your delectation. There are just a couple of other things I ought to do of a housekeeping kind before we do that. First of all, to launch at you a question of a sort of mastermind or university challenge type, and ask you to respond to it, and then at some point, probably towards the end of the session, I will reveal the answer. So the question that I'd like you now to ponder is as follows. Of the top 20 countries in terms of GDP growth in 2011, how many were African countries? 2, 4, 6, or 8? And if you press respond on your screens and have a stab at 2, 4, 6, or 8, we'll find out at the end of the session how perceptive and intelligent an audience you are. And I ask you now to join in a round of applause for our keynote speaker, Jacqueline Novogratz from the Acumen Fund.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. I've been asked to introduce this idea of the economies of tomorrow. And when we were at lunch before, we were saying, actually, what we're really talking about are the economies of today. And it reminds me of a quote I like from someone named William Gibson, where he says, "The future is already here. It just hasn't been widely distributed." And I think that's really key to what we're going to be talking about. Hans Rosling talks about these economies being youthful, young, they're urban, they're connected, they're vibrant. When it comes to connectivity, just two stats that really struck out for me. One is that Indians own more cell phones than they do toilets. And in Africa, which is 1/9 the size of the United States economy, you see 2 times as many cell phones on that continent. Something I've been thinking about in terms of what that kind of connection and connectivity actually mean is that I think that there's a yearning around the world through all classes, across all ethnicities, to be not just connected to one another, but to be part of one another. And About a month ago, I was in Peshawar on the border of Afghanistan talking to group of young 20-something leaders. And they had just finished a campaign they called Clean and Green Peshawar, where they'd used mobile technologies, Facebook, other apps, to get 4,000 people onto the streets to pick up litter, whitewash the walls. And literally 2 weeks after that, I was in the Nairobi slums with young men that I work with, and they had read my book, then they did this book club, then they started a business plan competition. From that, they decided that they needed to run TEDx conferences so that they could celebrate the vitality of what exists in the slums. And they've since run 40 across slums throughout Kenya. So the good news is that there's this young, vibrant population wanting to be part of something bigger. But of course, thinking about Amartya Sen in this glass half full, half empty, this is also a moment of urgency, thinking about the resources that we have. How will we build a world that is sustainable for 10 billion people, moving away from thinking of them as hungry mouths to feed, rather than what this world could look like if we really release that unlimited potential. What excites me most of all is to see these incredible entrepreneurs in every country in which we work. They are daring to go into places where markets refuse to go and where governments have failed, particularly when it comes to delivering basic services like water, health, housing, energy. And that's so important when 1.5 billion people today have no access to clean water or electricity, and 1 in 3 of us have no access to sanitation. So the way that I think we're going to see a lot of this happening is not only the entrepreneurs, but connecting those entrepreneurs to what we call patient capital. This idea of long-term investment capital, typically in the early stages backed by philanthropy, that measures its success based on long-term social impact, and secondarily on the profitability, the sustainability of those companies that it's building. I want to give you a couple of examples that we've seen so that we can open up the conversation. But it starts in a state called Bihar in India, back to Hans Rosling, and how within countries where there's huge investment opportunities, there are also very difficult areas to work. If you put Bihar on the African continent, it would be the second largest and the second poorest country. The average per capita income is about $200. Very little infrastructure, high levels of corruption and bureaucracy. And about 7 years ago, government declared 65 million people economically impossible to reach with conventional electricity. So enter the entrepreneur. Ganesh Pandey decides he is going to personally solve the energy crisis. And it takes him about 3 years of grant funding, all philanthropy, to fail over and over trying to TROFA other biofuels, solar, when he finally comes across the fact that he's in the middle of the rice belts. So he negotiates with farmers to take what they consider their waste, the husk from the rice, and he heats it, gasifies it, converts it to electricity, and starts building these microgrids in the far-flung rural areas. Needs government subsidy, good subsidy, to enable the price point to get to $1 to $2 per month so that the families can afford it. And an innovator inside government provides a 30% capital subsidy. It's only at this point where you've got a business model that looks like it can work with some plants operational that the patient capital can be put in by Acumen and other impact investors. Though at that time, when there are 5 plants, we know we've got to get to 500 just to break even. But also know that if we do this in a place where people feel that it's impossible to bring affordable, renewable energy, we can actually break the category. And so, long story, but today there are about 250 plants operating. More than 250,000 people are getting access to affordable energy on a regular basis. Government has a partner with which to work. We've been able to work on the governance and other operational issues of the company to prepare it for more commercial-ready kinds of capital. And we have a lot of impact that we can measure, not only in terms of people with energy, money that they've saved from not paying for dirty, polluting, expensive kerosene, income that has been increased because now they can stay awake later at night working. What we can't measure, though, might be the most important part of the story from my perspective, since I get to go into all of these villages now, and that is local democracy and community, freedom and justice. At the end of the day, these individuals really for the first time in many generations have opportunity and choice, which equals dignity. And if I have learned one thing in 12 years of investing in these markets, it is that dignity is more important to the spirit than wealth. We've seen this kind of patient capital, therefore, open up possibilities to bring people into the mainstream, not just economy, but the social economy. In water in India, doing UV filtration systems, again, on a community-based, decentralized approach, now serving 4 million people in India, bringing in copycat companies, moving into Bangladesh and West Africa. We've seen patient capital allow entrepreneurs to figure out, through a lot of experimentation and failure, how to enable low-income farmers and individuals increase the effectiveness of their own assets and resources. In Pakistan, the average dairy cow is 1/12 as productive as the cows in Europe and the United States. 35 million smallholders own between 1 and 3 cows. So we've invested very long-term in an artificial insemination company to bring in bull embryos from Europe, Jerseys and Holsteins, and price the AI sticks at such a level that the poor farmers can afford to buy them, and we're already seeing a 300 to 400% increase in their productivity. And then we've talked a lot about property rights, and we've seen over the last 25 years of working in Africa particularly, a lot of top-down approaches to bringing property rights to low-income people. We know how important it is, but typically those top-down national programs are too expensive, they're too complex, and they take too long for low-income people to access. So if you look at Ghana, the World Bank and other agencies have spent over $60 million in the last few years on a national registry system. It's important, but you can count in the hundreds the number of parcels that have actually been registered or certified. So we've invested in a company that's doing a parcel certification for smallholders, selling it for $100 a pop at a price that we believe will allow the company to be long-term sustainable. Already 1,500 parcels have been registered, which is more than any other entity in the country, and the company is talking to governments in other countries as well. So when I look at the possibilities that we're going to talk about in the economies of tomorrow, which are vibrant, which want to be part of it, we need a new kind of capital that does not replace traditional financial capital, but essentially allows us to build a pipeline because there is such extraordinary opportunity. But at the end of the day, what's needed most of all is leadership, because capital without it really gets us nowhere. And the kind of leadership that we need in new and old economies is one that pushes away trite assumption and petty ideology, is willing to take risk, is certainly willing and desiring of looking at low-income people not as passive recipients waiting for charity or waiting for government to save them, but as individual agents who want to solve their own problems, who want to be part of the solution. They are there, the entrepreneurs are there, and we just need to be more creative about the way that we think about investing and how we build a world where all 10 billion of us can flourish long into the future. I personally think there's never been a more exciting moment to live on this planet because of so much that's happening around the world, and look forward to this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Charles Tang from the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry to give a first response. Charles.
We have been talking about economics of tomorrow. We've been talking about investing in tomorrow's economy. I just arrived from China a couple of days ago, and I'm off to Brazil in a couple of days. And in these two countries, tomorrow's economy has already arrived. In fact, it has arrived for many years. Government policy, which I've been told doesn't work, has stimulated China to produce massive amounts of solar and wind equipment and other green energy that has been helping the world. And this, for example, Germany will renounce nuclear energy because with the help of the Chinese equipment, Germany will be self-sufficient with green energy, with renewable energy. We can take another example, such as Africa, which in such a few years, Africa has been totally transformed. The colonial masters have stripped Africa of their wealth and left Africa as a lost continent. China, through its massive investments in Africa and its infrastructure, has transformed Africa into a continent of hope. In Brazil, I'm told that government policy doesn't work and there are no viable biofuels programs on a massive scale. For more than 40 years, Brazil has been using ethanol, sugarcane ethanol, which is very different from corn ethanol. In sugarcane ethanol, we use the bagasse, that's left over after you squeeze the juice out of the sugarcane, and we burn it and transform it into energy. So all the plants, most of the plants are self-sufficient in energy, and in fact, the surplus energy is sold to the local grid. That is why, one of the reasons why sugarcane ethanol costs 40% of what corn ethanol costs, because corn ethanol, you utilize energy to create energy, and you compete against the food chain. As I said, Brazil's sugarcane program does not even displace food plantation, because I mentioned earlier, Brazil has 140 million hectares of land, which is the total amount of cultivated land in China that is not being used for any kind of use. Excluding the Amazon and excluding all the environmentally protected areas, Brazil today uses about 80 million hectares for its plantation. It has 200 million hectares for cattle grazing and 140 million hectares of land that are not being used. So the state governments in Brazil that I represent, such as the state of Pará, which is 15% of Brazil's territory, will offer free use of land to investors who would like to invest in agribusiness in Brazil and join the green economy. So I have, our chamber, Brazil-China Chamber, we are not really involved in policy discussions, although we did partner with the United Nations in the Human Settlement and Green Mobility Conference at the Rio +20. Although many people say that Rio +20 did not have concrete results, just the fact that so many world leaders gathered together to discuss this problem, to me, I think it was a great result. So we are really working to make it happen. We're taking 5 solar and wind companies from China to invest in Brazil, because Brazil has a big wind program and it's starting its solar program. And also in Brazil, we are helping BYD send, Warren Buffett's an investor in BYD, and we're sending 50 electric buses to Sao Paulo because most of the pollution in the big metropolis is basically from the diesel engines and the automobiles. So basically with that, I would like to rephrase that, tomorrow has arrived, but we must educate our children and our people against wastage, for conservation and preservation, so that we can indeed, continue into the future with our economics of tomorrow. Thank you.
Well, I spot some chunky themes. Camilla Toulmin, Director of the International Institute for Environment and Development. Camilla.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And I think I echo much of what Jackie and Charles have just said. I think there was huge energy behind the green economy debates in Rio that will engender a lot of new opportunities for investment in many of today and tomorrow's economies. I think it's particularly important at a period of very rapid growth, particularly of the urban centres that we're seeing certainly in many parts of Africa, that we avoid lock into high carbon infrastructure, investment, energy, transport in those countries, and see ways in which we can encourage them to invest in low carbon, more resilient patterns of urban development. I wanted to pick up particularly on the question of institutions, of land and property rights that Jackie mentioned, because particularly in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there are very weak, uncertain, unwritten rights to land and forests, to water, to grazing, which mean that local people are very vulnerable to seizure of those resources by government, by inward investors. And particularly, I think it was Mark Twain said that the thing about land is they're not making it anymore. I think we're likely to see a rise in the value and competition for these increasingly valuable resources. So pressures are only going to grow. So what does that mean could usefully be done? Well, I think the example that you gave of the work going on in Ghana is typical of an approach that we need to see a lot more of. That's to say, I think we need to be able to design and innovate in institutions and the way that institutions work so that they respond to the needs of the many rather than the needs of the few. And I think a metaphor perhaps explains that best for me. In an irrigation system, you can have a few very big canals that channel large quantities of water to a few places, or you can have an irrigation system that's got lots and lots and lots of tiny feeder canals that deliver water to each and every individual field. And I'd like to see much more of the institutional development following the second kind of model. I find with institutions, because they're intangible, invisible, we need to find a better language to talk about the different options and choices that are faced. I think the second thing I'd like to say is that I think we also need to be clever and to innovate in the sorts of investment and business models that such investment can support. We're working at the moment with a series of slum dweller groups in Africa and Asia. And through small amounts of philanthropic funding, you can combine neighborhood savings groups with city government, with philanthropic money to make really major improvements to shelter, to upgrading of slum conditions, to improving access to water and sanitation. But it's very much built up from below. So it's seeing how we can encourage investment to come in and support this building up from below that I think is going to be key to building the economies of today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. And finally, at this stage, Amit Mehra, the man behind the phone app, which goes to 5 million farmers in India distributing agricultural information. Amit.
Thanks, Mark. I have two sort of big points to make, and I'm going to take the perspective of the grassroots management, which is trying to build businesses that have are in a sustainable way trying to solve social problems. But just a quick context linking to the theme of the 2 days, resource inefficiency. A few data points. India is the only country that remains in the world which still employs 600 million people, directly or indirectly, in agriculture. China itself is now 450 million. And contributes only about 17 to 18% of GDP. $6 billion worth of fruits and vegetables go waste every year. 82% of the farm holdings are less than 2 hectares, very inefficient. Farmers get less than 20 to 25% of the price of the final produce. So whatever way you look at it, one more data point, pulses. We're the highest producer of pulses in the world, but 98th in the productivity of pulses. So no matter what angle you look at, it's very resource inefficient. So to address this, and this is caused by a lot of issues related to warehousing, availability of markets, lack of financial credit, etc. But it had a lot to do with the information that farmers had access to or did not have access to. And very quickly, what we do is really not an app, actually. What we have built is a system that allows farmers to get information from pre-sowing to post-harvest. So for each stage of the crop cycle, depending on whether it's weather forecast, whether it is market prices, local intelligence, or farm solutions advisory, bases their personalized preferences and farm situations. So date of sowing, type of soil, type of irrigation, and that goes as simple SMS 3 to 4 times a day. And the impact, I'll quickly share, I was in Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh just last Friday, sitting with my team, which was telling me a story of a farmer down south, actually, who has now increased their productivity, his productivity, by 80% for bananas, just because he was getting the right information at the right time in the local language as per his personal preferences. Now, we also, another example close to my heart is, again, of a banana grower who was telling me, I was selling my bananas for 4 rupees a kilo, and the middleman came to buy for 4 rupees, and I said, look, the RML prices are telling me that it has gone to 9 rupees in the same markets that you go and sell to. So without changing the buyer, the market, or the day, he was able to get 7 rupees. So it was a significant jump. And he was, the dignity that it added to his life, that he could talk back to the middleman was overwhelming. I never forget that example. Now, to get us there, we had to go through a lot of challenges. And I believe that one of the solutions to those challenges is patient capital. We had to build the local content network, which didn't exist for the farmers. So 400 people actually create content on a daily basis for the farming community. We had to build the technology and the product that allows the farmer to receive it on a personalized basis, not on broadcast basis. It doesn't matter if I grow onion and I live in this sort of house in the same village, my neighbor grows tomatoes. He gets different prices, different information, different news, different advisory. So we had to build that technology, and we also had to build, as Camilla, you said, the local business model that allowed us to distribute in a cost-effective way. Now, to do that, 2 points I wanted to make. I'll make the first one right now and the next one later, that you need patient capital because you're trying to solve inherently difficult issue of livelihood, productivity, production, ultimately income growth. And it takes a long time to figure out the sort of the operating model, the product, the technology, the team, the partnerships, etc. And you have to work with a coalition of the willing. You have to work with the NGOs. You have to work, as we heard the whole day yesterday, with the governments, the state government. In India, agriculture is state government. So you have to engage with each government separately. And it takes time. But you need, I want to add 2 more words to your patient capital. You need impatient management. You need people on the ground who are truly incentivized, especially in emerging economies, if you want to build something of scale that can be replicated and is financially sustainable. I think that is something that I haven't seen much of since I moved to India. And I've seen people wanting to sort of claim that you're working in the social sector or you're trying to solve something which is not going to give enough returns to the investors. Therefore, you should go with something less than the market value. It just doesn't work. You don't get the best talent that you need in marketing, that you need in technology, that you need in distribution, that will stay with you long enough, because it requires that much time, that will stay with you long enough to create a sustainable and scalable impact. So that was my first point. Patient capital, but very impatient management, which is rightly incentivized based on market value.
100% agree.
Amit, thank you very much. At this point, just before we have a discussion here about some of the themes that have emerged, I should remind you that you can submit questions if you're inhibited from putting your hand up later on, because we will use that old-fashioned technology of hand raising for questions after this. But if you want to submit a question via the pad in front of you, I'll scoop some up from time to time using the refresh button here. But I wonder whether I might start with something I think has emerged in slightly different ways, I think, from some of the contributions we've heard, which is the notion of dignity and perhaps particularly applying it to land rights, because I think we have 2 different models here of the way land might be used and defined in terms of economic development. I think we had from Charles a view that there was a lot of land available and that with the correct incentives, it could and should rapidly be used for economic advantage. And implicitly, I think we heard from Jacqueline and Camilla in particular, words like, as it were, dignity and institutional good governance, which at least to me suggested that land might be a more complicated issue for them than it might be for Charles. So if I start with Jacqueline, and would you like to talk about land rights and the way it fits into entrepreneurial economic development?
Sure. Torn between an agricultural land story in Ghana, but I think what I'll go with is is a housing story in Pakistan. In Pakistan, one way in these very difficult markets to make a lot of money is through land speculation. Most of the land in the country has been purchased often by military, and so to actually secure land for low-income people is extraordinarily difficult to do because it is so expensive. So we have an entrepreneur, and it goes to Amit's point, that has had a vision of putting low-income people into affordable, beautiful homes. And it took, the first time we went together to do it, we lent him about $350,000 on a pilot basis. And it took a year and a half just to register the land because you have to pay bribes to the local registrar. We were very public about it. And we have patient capital, so we could wait. Long story short, there are now 2,000 people living in this development. It's become a real flagship, and we were able to help change housing policy. Well, the bad news is we then therefore got more visible. And so in this second for-profit housing development where we've taken an equity position in a mixed income development, the price of success is often new kinds of problems. And so there was this beautiful access road, which one night looked as if a drone had attacked it in the morning, just totally torn up. And now we're in all of these different, the entrepreneur and Acumen is in all these different struggles to try to release that. If we were a simple financial investor, we already would have increased our money by 100%, no problem. But because this is patient capital and we are focused on getting low-income housing to poor people in a country that has a 7.5 million unit shortfall today, we are sticking this out. We need really, really great talent to help us in this battle. But there are very few forces that will go against the private speculators to create real land for low-income people. And so it's a different kind of conversation that needs to be had. Camilla could probably talk about some of what we're seeing in agriculture, where you're seeing some international private equity firms buying huge swaths of land that have never had land rights attached to it, pushing smallholder farmers off. They feel that they're being paid fairly at some level, often for biofuels or exports of food to other countries. Whether that's right or wrong is one whole conversation, but the mistrust that is stirred up from all of this uncertainty around land and land rights is a part of this conversation.
So, Camilla, I'm going to make the argument cruder than it needs to be, but nevertheless, I think there's something in it. I mean, what I got from Charles's presentation was, if you get on with it, and don't, as it were, overanalyze where the land rights belong, given that Brazil is such a large country with so much potentially unused land, you're going to get quicker results than if you put too much stress on abstract notions of dignity and even empirical ones of governance. And it could be that your dignity is, in fact, or your interest in dignity is holding up economic development which would improve lives.
That's a very nice, clear, simple way of putting things. I'm not going to talk about Brazil because Charles clearly knows that context very much better than me. What has been intriguing and worrying us at my institute for the last few years has been seeing this competition for acquiring inward investment from a whole number of different African governments who've seen the need to modernize their agricultural sector. Now, modernization can take various different forms, but it's tended to flow down a route of large scale is best, mechanized if possible, bring on the private sector, and everything can go forward. What you've tended to also have is a set of circumstances in which formally documented land rights are very thin on the ground. more than 90% of land in West Africa has no formal documentation around it. And what that then does is to create very strong incentives for government to allocate those resources to inward investors, very often in a process of contracting, which is very untransparent. So I guess what our colleagues in many of these countries have been asking for is that that process of trying to attract investment, think about quality, not quantity, think about the long-term returns that government could be getting from more careful investment in the agricultural sector, and thinking about business models that don't displace local people, that see them as actually having skills, energy, sets of knowledge about that locality that can be put to use in an attractive investment proposition.
Mark, can I just jump in with an example of that? Because what's exciting is that we are seeing these kinds of models that are starting in Ghana. Toksam Mbola and Iggy Bassi had seen Brazilian farming methods, saw how superior they were. Ghana imports 70% of its rice, which is its major staple. You can buy Uncle Ben's if you go to Ghana, but you can't buy any Ghanaian rice in the grocery store. And so but they knew they couldn't, they wanted to do it the right way. They wanted trust with communities. So they negotiated essentially 7,000 hectares with a local 50,000 person clan, with the tribal chief, for 50-year lease, so that they could have a commercial farm. But they also negotiated a revenue share with the community, and a promise to train 7,000 smallholders around the periphery of this main farm, so that they could do higher grades of rice and overall have a profitable company. In 2 harvests, they've become the largest rice producer in Ghana. And so they're able to benefit from the larger scale Brazilian methods, as well as recognizing that you've got this incredibly rural, undereducated, underemployed population, enabling them as well. So the community is actually not going to sabotage. The community really wants this to work. And then it's just funny to meet the Ghanaians who can only speak Wolof and Portuguese these days, who are the farm workers. So it's fascinating to see this moving.
I want to turn in a minute to patient capital and bring Amit back in. I just want to put it to Charles. How can you be confident that the land rights, which you think are not really of any use and therefore should be right for large-scale entrepreneurial investment and now, that those large portions of land actually don't belong to somebody, even if it's not necessarily codified as such, that there are informal local rights that might suggest that the economic model of development that you've put forward could in fact be strongly disruptive to people's dignity and ownership?
Well, basically, I've been talking about government-owned land. So the land that we are offering for investors to use is not like private land. It's government land. So there are no disputes about the property of this land. It's just that for the government, the state government, to have somebody to come in and make investments, pay taxes to the state, employ the people of the state, and earn export earnings for the state is much better than having just the land sitting there. Like I said, for example, the state of Pará is 1.25 million square kilometers. That's 15% of Brazil. And there's only 7 million people who live in that state. In China, you would have 200 million people living in that state, So I think that development brings dignity. Human dignity, a minimum level of human dignity, is extremely important, and that's the essence of human rights. And to that effect, successive Chinese governments since Deng Xiaoping have made the largest and the greatest achievement of human rights in the history of mankind. Chinese governments have brought out of poverty 800 million people. It has allowed 39.5 million Brazilian people to achieve a minimum level of human dignity, and the countless millions of Africans as well. So development is essential for human dignity. You cannot have human dignity without a minimum possibility of surviving with a roof and food. And to this effect, like I said, successive Chinese governments have made the greatest contribution to human rights in the history of mankind.
At this stage, I will resist getting a debate going on that because I don't think we'll get to the audience. It may be picked up by the audience. I just want, but really very briefly, because I would then like to bring in the audience, to discuss a little bit the concept of patient capital, which in one way or another, most of you talked about. Starting with Amit, I mean, your statistics about how bad production was in India compared to actual total volume were rather startling. Is it your view, and I'll ask the others the same, that patient capital is really not a state function in these developed or developing economies, that they're simply not good enough at doing it, there are too many obstacles, and the patient capital needs to be formed by organizations like, as it were, Camilla's or indeed Jacqueline's?
Absolutely. I'll just add one more statistic on the sort of patient capital that comes from the government. There was a curve that I just recently saw drawn by one of the chairmen of a leading rural bank, agriculture bank, which showed the investment or the credit that has gone to agriculture had grown from $10 billion to nearly $100 billion in the last 10 years. And on the same graph, he drew the production of cereals, which is predominantly what India produces, which had moved from anywhere between 195 million tons to at best sort of 220, 250. So that curve was almost flat, and this curve had gone all the way. So clearly he was confused. He says, I don't know where the money is going. Is it going in increasing production? No. Is it increasing productivity? Clearly no, because we have those statistics validating that as well. And it's not having the impact on livelihood because agriculture growth has been less than 4%, 2% in most of the years. So the right source for that is the, I wouldn't even say the corporates. I would say structures and organizations like yours, the Acumen Fund. And my second point that I didn't make earlier on was that you need consistent governance while you need persistent management to keep on fighting, you keep building the product, to keep solving customer pain, to keep partnering with various people who don't necessarily work at the same pace as you would like them to. It takes a lot of time, but you need consistent governance, which somehow doesn't come when there's a corporate structure trying to solve such problem, which should be replicated and should be scalable and financially sustainable. So I'm a big supporter, having sort of learned it the hard way, that you need, first, you definitely need patient capital and impatient management, which is incentivized with market-based salaries in emerging economies, because they would rather spend money on going to the malls and lounges rather than working for improving productivity in agriculture. So if you want to attract them, you need to give them that sort of incentive. And second point was you need consistent governance for a period of 5 to 7 years. If you're starting something truly innovative, something that we didn't exist before we started. Yeah, and therefore it must come in a combination, perhaps, but has to have the component of the investment community that takes a slightly longer term view, as we learned yesterday from David Nabarro and so many others, that even the governments don't necessarily have that longer view, and we need the investor community to play a big role in that.
Amit, so now really no more than a couple of sentences each on this. The difficulty of engendering enough capital formation or patient capital through states as opposed to through organizations like yours, Jacqueline.
I think that there's a real interest, growing interest in patient capital. What's happened is, including from states, the excitement is around more commercially viable activities. So there's states that were giving aid directly away and seeing 100% go out the door are now looking for 10 and 20% returns. What we need is for government to see that money as money that can be constantly renewed, but give it as grants to patient capital funds and hold them accountable for getting that money back, providing side-by-side technical assistance. So there's a real interest and desire, both by individual philanthropists and investors as well as governments, but it's at the top end. And frankly, there's not a lot of pipeline for commercially viable activity. The stuff that Amit is doing, the stuff that Acumen funds, is much more early stage. It's about creating markets that never existed for some of the poorest people on the planet. And Government has not provided the R&D, so we need to create systems that allow private initiative and private capital essentially to do that work of providing the R&D, building the business models to ready for the more commercial capital. That's the money that's missing.
Camilla.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. Not much to add, except that I think what's then helpful to do is to document those models to show how it can be done, so that you've then got opportunities to spread much more broadly the learning from those new sorts of business models. I mean, I think people tend to think that, you know, they know how to do something, and what you have to do is to show that actually there are multiple ways of addressing a particular problem. So innovation in policy design, innovation in business models that show different routes are possible.
Charles, I'll bring you in a minute on this question of how to channel patient capital correctly, but I'd like to give the audience a chance to get stuck in. So can I see anybody who's got a question, if you could raise a hand? Can I see anybody? Oh yeah, there's somebody right at the back. If you could just say very, very briefly who you are.
My name is Jonathan Rose, and I had a question for Charles, who talked about China's investment in Africa and in Brazil, and my understanding is that a lot of when the Chinese government invests, it brings Chinese companies to actually do the work. So what do you think the role is of what percentage is the appropriate percentage of local employment that should be made when somebody invests in a local market?
Well, many of these investments in Brazil, I mean, a lot of them are done by SOEs, Chinese SOEs, but also a lot of them are done by private Chinese companies. You know, BYD is a private company. They plan to build an electric bus factory in Brazil. We're talking about Sany, which is building, you know, the road construction equipment factory in Brazil, and so on. So Brazil needs investments. Brazil's economy and Chinese economy are very complementary. Brazil needs capital to create jobs and to grow its economy, which is slowing down. China has an excess of capital, but needs the strategic resources that Brazil can supply to China. China must become strategic resource independent. So it must have access to the sources of the strategic resources, such as the minerals and the petroleum and the land for food security of the Chinese people. So, you know, they're two complementary economies, and Brazil is gaining a lot because a lot of the Chinese investments in Brazil are also joint ventures with Brazilian companies who otherwise would not have the capital.
But if I have it right, I think the question was coming back to this balance between dignity and development, which of course I totally accept are not at opposite ends of a spectrum, but nevertheless, what I took the spirit of the question to be about was whether there are enough safeguards or incentives to ensure that this investment is directed in such a way that people who live in the area directly participate in the economic activity as well as in the fruits of the economic activity.
Absolutely. You know, when, you know, representing the state governments I do, we very much want to attract investment, whether Chinese or American or whatever, so that we can develop these municipalities or the state, which, you know, Pará state and Mato Grosso do Sul state, they're not the richest states in Brazil, but we do want to transform them into much richer states.
Take some more questions. There's a gentleman over here in the blue shirt. And if you could again briefly just say who you are.
Yes, I'm Glenn Diger with CH Hill. It's great to see these examples. So we know an awful lot about what to do. My question is really simple, is why isn't 10 times or 100 times this activity occurring? And I ask the question because if we knew why it's not occurring at a much greater rate, then we could try to fix that.
Can I quickly take that
as
an example? So, you know, it took us 4 years, despite the innovation that happened in India and all validated by, you know, independent bodies, USA, GIZ, you know, business schools, etc. The example that I gave were quantitatively verified. It took us 4 years to get the first order from the central government to actually reach out to 100,000 farmers, despite the fact that the noise was loud and clear that it is having a positive impact. So I think the answer to that is what I think the lady said from the World Bank earlier on, that you need to do a lot of education and convincing of the governments, and it takes time. And once you get there, I think then there is a likelihood, and you need to create a lot of evidence at scale for the government to take notice. If it is really small scale and it has been there for a short period of time, it just doesn't fly. So that's, I think, a big component. If you're trying to build something, that you have to keep engaging with the government. She used the word marketing, and I completely agree. You've got to do a lot of marketing with the principal secretaries and the state ministers to kind of convince them that they need to put their muscle behind it to help this scale.
But in Brazil, the government is doing the wealth transfer program, and as Rachel Kyle said earlier from the World Bank, Brazil is also doing the green transfer, i.e. paying for maintaining the green forests of the Amazon.
So I'm going to ask Jacqueline and Camilla the answer to this very, very large question to be compressed into soundbite length. Why is it when we know what it is that we should be doing, we're not succeeding in doing it?
I think because what we should be doing is not easily broken down into a simple answer. It's not just give us more grant money, nor is it the markets as usual. It's this middle space where it might cost us 20 or 30% of the dollar that we invest to create a company that long-term can bring enormous benefits and financial revenues. But that space is not comfortable. And I actually feel very confident that we're starting to see so much change that we will see it open up. But we need some brave institutions to step forward and be ready to put in that grant support for investment, recognizing that they don't need to get the money back with interest. They just need to put it into a permanent fund, and we'll see real change.
Yeah, I think it's largely because there's, well, I think two things. One, I think that many parts of Africa have still got a perception problem. As we heard from Hans Rosling yesterday, even the well-educated Swedes still have got attitudes towards the rest of the world in terms of their information that are now 25 years old. That's to say the world is changing very rapidly. Many African countries are changing extremely rapidly. And I think a lot of the investment community and general public haven't caught up. I think it's also the sort of ultimate in a public-private problem that needs a public-private partnership. And within the public and the private, I would include both kind of local government, local communities, and also philanthropic and other sources of money that together can take on some of these challenges in a concerted, geographically focused way.
Take one more very, very quick question before I reveal the answer to the quiz question which I posed to you at the front. And if nobody is burning, then I will do the quiz. So the Lord Patton, no less.
Chris Patton, Chancellor of the University. Land tenure and ownership. Don't we know from what the government in China themselves have said, and from social networking sites, that one of the principal causes of social turbulence in China are disputes about land tenure and land ownership? So why should it be different in Brazil or Africa? Isn't it a really crucial issue to resolve? I mean, it is in China. Why not elsewhere in the world?
So I need to do this extremely briefly in the interest of keeping you all in order for the rest of the afternoon. But given where the question comes from, I think it deserves some kind of a stab at an answer. So we've had a bit of a go at land tenure, but what Lord Patton is suggesting is it is, if not the central, such a central question that it needs perhaps more dealing with than I'm looking particularly at Charles than perhaps is implied by your model. So perhaps I just ask Charles briefly to respond to Lord Patton's point.
Yeah, land tenure is extremely important for investment. Nobody's going to invest in something that you cannot be sure of. In Brazil, there are, you know, especially around the Amazon, is a lot of problems about land tenure. But you know, when I'm talking about offering government-owned land for investment use, we're offering land that does not have a problem of land tenure, because it's government-owned land and not private property, which can have a lot of issues of land tenure.
All I want from the other three is more or less a one-word answer. Land tenure central to the equation, sorting out where entrepreneurial opportunities are best done with dignity.
Critical.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and China's got a lot to teach on that, in fact, as well, with the household responsibility system that came in at the end of the 70s, saw fantastic increases in productivity in China precisely because they gave much more secure tenure rights to their own farmers. It should be said that it's not just China that's acquiring land round and about. There's a lot of European, North American, and Gulf countries involved as well. So I think it's a mistake just to see it as a Chinese.
And Mark, before you cut us off, it also has to be said that land tenure is a critical issue for gender, for women, and their power and their dignity throughout the world.
Okay, so I think next year's conference, if it ever exists, will begin with land tenure. I just want to give a recap on the question before I send you off for your tea break. Of the top 20 countries in terms of GDP growth in 2011, how many were African countries? Was it 2, 4, 6, or 8? And there it is. The answer, I'm fairly sure, is supposed to be 8, and that is the majority of this very, very intelligent audience succeeded. But you're in Oxford, and we would expect nothing less. Thank you very much. And could you join me in a round of applause for the panel? Thank you very much indeed.